He was one of the most successful African-American CEOs in real estate, a man whose name carried respect in boardrooms and beyond. But behind the polished walls of his own company, something darker was happening, something he could only uncover by stepping into the shoes of those at the very bottom. Dressed as a janitor, he swept floors no one noticed and listened to words no one thought he'd hear. What he discovered in just one night would shake him to his core and cost his employees everything. Before the world knew him as a sharp, unshakable leader in real estate, Marcus Johnson's story began in a neighborhood where opportunity was rare and hope felt like a luxury. Raised by a single mother who worked double shifts as a nurse, Marcus grew up hearing the same whispered doubts from people who thought they already knew his future. Yet, he refused to let the weight of poverty or prejudice dictate who he would become. Every late-night study session, every small job he picked up as a teenager, was fuel for a dream that stretched far beyond the limits others tried to place on him. By the time Marcus reached his 30s, he was no longer the boy others doubted. He was the man they underestimated. With sheer determination and relentless discipline, he built one of the fastest-growing real estate companies in the state. His name carried influence, his properties stood tall in city skylines, and his success was undeniable. To the outside world, he was living proof that hard work could break through barriers. But behind his composed demeanor, Marcus knew the truth. Racism didn't disappear just because you reached the top. It only changed its shape, becoming more hidden, more insidious. Boardroom smiles often masked unspoken judgments, and partnerships sometimes crumbled the moment race came into the equation. Yet Marcus pressed forward, determined not to let those shadows define him. Inside his company, he expected fairness and respect to be the standard. He had built a workplace that looked polished from the outside, with carefully written policies, and a smiling HR team that spoke of diversity in brochures. But Marcus couldn't ignore the quiet unease he sometimes felt when he visited the branches of his firm. A shift in tone when he entered the room. The way certain employees stiffened or masked their conversations when he passed by. Something was happening behind the polished image of his company, something no quarterly report could ever show. He began to hear whispers, not direct complaints, but fragments of conversations, casual remarks from people who thought he wasn't listening. Words that hinted at disrespect, at prejudice, at behaviors that clashed with the values he had worked so hard to uphold. And though Marcus was respected as the CEO, he understood a painful reality. People act differently when they know the boss is watching. So he began to wonder, what would happen if he wasn't Marcus Johnson, the CEO? What if he was just another face in the building, unseen and underestimated? What would he hear? What would he see? The thought lingered, gnawing at him during sleepless nights. He wanted to believe his company was free of the very discrimination he had fought his whole life to overcome. But deep down, he knew the only way to find out the truth was to erase his title and his power, to strip himself of everything that demanded respect and step into the world of those most often ignored. Marcus made a decision that would change everything. He would go undercover in his own company, not as a consultant, not as an observer, but as a cleaner, someone invisible, someone easy to dismiss, someone who could move through the office unseen, picking up more than trash. To his employees, he would be nobody. To himself, he would be closer than ever to the truth. And as Marcus prepared for this quiet investigation, he had no idea that what he was about to witness in the shadows of his own business would not only expose racism where he least expected it, but also force him to take an action so drastic it would leave his entire company shaken. Marcus arrived at the office the next morning before sunrise, not in his tailored suit but in worn jeans and a faded work shirt. The mirror that usually reflected authority and wealth now revealed a man intentionally stripped of those things. In his hands, he carried a mop and bucket borrowed from a friend who managed a janitorial service. He felt the weight of transformation. It wasn't just a disguise, it was erasure. For the first time in decades, he would walk into his own company, unseen, judged not by his title, but by his skin and the clothes on his back. The security guard barely glanced at him when he entered. That in itself was a revelation. Marcus was used to being greeted with polished smiles, respectful nods, and the hurried politeness that followed power. But now, in the eyes of the guard, he was invisible, waved through the back door like a delivery man. It struck him hard. Respect wasn't tied to who he was, but to what people believed he represented. As he pushed his cart through the lobby, Marcus felt the building differently. The gleaming marble floors, the glass walls, the carefully chosen artwork, all things he had approved, all things he had paid for, felt distant. They weren't his tonight. They belonged to the people who thought they owned the space with their presence, who would never suspect that the man cleaning after them was the one who built it all. The first hours passed quietly. He swept, wiped, and emptied bins. To most, he was just background noise. But it wasn't long before the real reason he was there began to reveal itself. In the break room, two mid-level managers entered, their voices echoing against the tile walls. They didn't see him at first, crouched by the counter as he scrubbed coffee stains. Their conversation was casual, but their words were knives. "Can you believe the boss?" one sneered. "Always parading around like he's some big shot. Lucky break, if you ask me. No way someone like him should be running a company like this. We all know how he really got here." The other laughed. "Yeah, check the diversity quotas. That's all it is. He's the poster boy. Without that, he'd still be selling houses in some rundown neighborhood." Marcus's grip tightened on, the rag in his hand. The sting wasn't just in their words, but in their confidence. They spoke freely, assured that no one of importance would ever hear them. To them, he was invisible, just another cleaner blending into the walls. He wanted to stand, to confront them, to tear away the mask and let them choke on the weight of their arrogance. But he stayed still. He listened, because this was exactly why he was here, to hear the truth people only spoke when they thought no one was listening. As the night stretched on, Marcus witnessed more than he expected. In whispered jokes shared between desks, in snide remarks about clients of color, in the dismissive tones used toward employees in lower positions. It wasn't just disrespect aimed at him as their CEO. It was a culture, a silent permission that had crept into the corners of his company, poisoning the very foundation he built. At one point, he watched as a young receptionist nervously handed documents to a senior manager. She was Latina, soft-spoken, and visibly anxious. The manager snatched the papers, glanced at them, and muttered under his breath words Marcus would never forget. "Figures. Can't expect much from someone like her?" The receptionist lowered her gaze, forced a smile, and retreated. Marcus felt rage boiling in his chest. That young woman reminded him of his own mother, who had endured similar treatment while working. Endless shifts just to keep food on the table. To see the same cruelty repeating itself in a company that bore his name, it was unbearable. But the worst moment came near dawn, when Marcus overheard a group of employees gathered near the elevators. They were laughing, relaxed after a late night of work, unaware of the man sweeping behind them. One of them spoke louder than the rest. "You know what's funny? The boss thinks he owns us, but really, he's just the face. The money guys are the real power. I bet the board keeps him around for show. You know, makes the company look good. Like, hey, we've got a black CEO, aren't we progressive?" The laughter that followed was cruel, dismissive, cutting deeper than any insult. Marcus froze. In that moment, he wasn't just undercover. He was exposed, raw, stripped of everything but the reality of what they thought of him. Not a leader, not a builder, not a visionary. Just a symbol, tolerated for optics, mocked when his back was turned. Every muscle in his body screamed to reveal himself, to unleash the authority that pulsed in his veins. But he didn't. He pushed his mop silently, heart pounding, as the voices of betrayal echoed in his ears. The rising sun spilled through the lobby windows as Marcus finished his shift. He left unnoticed, the weight of the night pressing down on him like an avalanche. He had come searching for truth, and he had found it, uglier and more painful than he ever imagined. His success hadn't shielded him. His title hadn't protected him. The rot was there, festering within the walls of his own empire. As he walked back to his car, his disguise still clinging to him, Marcus knew the night had changed everything. What he had seen couldn't be unseen. What he had heard couldn't be forgotten. And the decision he would make next would tear through the company like a storm. Because Marcus Johnson wasn't just cleaning floors. He was preparing to clean house. The following morning, Marcus didn't arrive in disguise. He walked into the company as the man everyone recognized, the CEO, sharp suit, polished shoes, and the quiet authority that had always commanded respect. But this time, he carried something, heavier than any title. The knowledge of what had been said, what had been done, what had been hidden when people thought he wasn't watching. He entered the boardroom with calm precision, though inside, his emotions raged like a storm. Rage, betrayal, sorrow, all of it pulsed beneath his skin. The very employees who had laughed at him, who had questioned his worth, now greeted him with forced smiles and scripted pleasantries. They had no idea that just hours ago, those same words had been daggers in his chest. As the meeting began, Marcus scanned the room. The very managers who had spoken so freely in the break room now sat upright, adjusting their ties, pretending loyalty. The senior staff who had joked about him being a poster boy avoided his eyes, shuffling papers, waiting for the agenda to distract them from the truth they didn't know he carried. But Marcus wasn't there to discuss budgets, acquisitions, or client reports. He was there for something else. He stood at the head of the table, his silence stretching until the room grew uncomfortable. One by one, people shifted in their seats, glancing at each other, waiting for him to speak. And then, with a calm voice that masked the storm inside him, Marcus began. "Last night," he said slowly, "I decided to see this company differently, to see it not from this chair, not from behind this title, but from the ground floor." A ripple of confusion crossed the room. Some managers exchanged puzzled looks. Marcus continued, his voice steady but laced with quiet intensity. "I came here not as your CEO, not as the man you recognize in meetings, but as a cleaner, a nobody, someone you thought wasn't worth noticing." The silence deepened. A few gasps slipped through the air. Others froze, color draining from their faces as realization struck. And then Marcus began recounting, in chilling detail, everything he had witnessed. The laughter, the jokes, the comments about diversity quotas, the disdain for the receptionist, the whispers about him being nothing more than a figurehead. Each word landed like a hammer. With every revelation, the walls of pretense crumbled. Those who had been guilty of the remarks shifted in their seats, eyes darting to the table, knuckles whitening as they gripped pens or shuffled papers to mask their shame. Marcus's voice never wavered. He didn't yell. He didn't raise his tone. Instead, he spoke with the kind of calm that made every word feel heavier, more permanent. His authority was no longer about his position. It was about truth, and truth weighed more than any title ever could. "You see," he said, locking eyes with the men who had mocked him, "success does not erase racism. A suit does not erase judgment. A title does not erase hate. I built this company brick by brick, but what I discovered last night is that prejudice still lives here, festering in the shadows." The room was suffocating with tension. No one dared to speak. The polished masks they wore every day had shattered, and there was no hiding from what Marcus had laid bare. And then, the moment of reckoning. Marcus straightened, his gaze sweeping across the table. I will not allow my company, my life's work, to be poisoned by people who refuse to respect the values this business was built on. So hear me clearly. For those of you who laughed, who spoke with hate, who diminished others because of who they are, your time here is over. The words detonated like a bomb. Shock rippled across the room. Some faces turned pale, others flushed with panic. The guilty ones knew exactly who they were. There would be no second chances, no excuses. No hiding behind polite smiles. Marcus laid out names. One by one he called them, not in anger, but in certainty. The very employees who had spoken so freely in the shadows now had their reputations stripped bare under the light of truth. One manager tried to speak, his voice trembling. "Sir, I didn't—" Marcus cut him off with a glance sharper than any blade. "Don't insult me by denying what I heard with my own ears." The room fell silent again. What lingered now wasn't just fear. It was respect. A different kind of respect. Not the forced politeness people offered to a powerful CEO, but the undeniable respect for a man who refused to be diminished, who refused to be silent, who refused to let injustice hide in his house. But Marcus wasn't finished. "This company bears my name," he said, his voice low and unshakable. "And if my name means anything, it will mean fairness. It will mean dignity. It will mean respect. For every single person who walks through these doors, no matter their color, their background, or their role, if you cannot live by those values, you do not belong here." His words were final, uncompromising, absolute. The boardroom was heavy with silence, broken only by the pounding of hearts and the quiet scrape of chairs as the guilty began to gather their things. They left the room in humiliation, stripped of the power they had thought was untouchable. Marcus watched them go, his expression unreadable. But inside, he knew this was more than firing employees. It was ripping out rot from the foundation of something he had built with his blood and sweat. Yet as the door closed behind the last of them, Marcus felt the weight of something else, pressing down on him. Because while he had removed the obvious offenders, he knew the problem ran deeper than a few individuals. The comments, the sneers, the laughter. It was a culture, a disease that had been allowed to breathe in the shadows. Removing a few people wouldn't cure it, it would take more, much more, and that realization was both empowering and terrifying. Marcus sat back in his chair, the boardroom eerily quiet, the remaining employees staring at him with a mix of awe and fear. He had drawn the line, made the choice, and now there was no turning back, but the question loomed over him like a shadow. Could he truly transform the soul of his company, or had the poison already spread too far? When the last guilty manager walked out of the boardroom, the silence that followed was unlike anything Marcus had ever experienced in his career. It wasn't the silence of failure, nor the quiet pause after a deal was struck. It was the silence of reckoning, a silence heavy with truth, with fear, with possibility. The remaining employees sat frozen, unsure whether to breathe relief or brace for more. For them, the sight of a CEO going undercover, of exposing racism in his own house was unthinkable. For Marcus, it was necessary. It was survival, not for himself, but for the soul of the company he had built from nothing. In the days that followed, news of what had happened spread like wildfire through the organization. Whispers traveled across hallways, emails carried speculation, and suddenly, everyone knew. The CEO had walked among them as a cleaner. He had seen what no leader was ever supposed to see. He had heard the words people only dared to say when they thought no one of consequence was listening. Some employees reacted with fear, wondering who else had been exposed. others with shame, replaying in their minds the casual remarks they once dismissed as harmless. But for many, especially the marginalized employees who had long carried silent burdens, the revelation was a release. They had always known the ugliness, lived there. They had always felt it in the stares, the subtle comments, the dismissive tone in meetings. And now, finally, someone with the power to change it had acknowledged their truth. Marcus spent the next week restructuring, not just firing, but reshaping. Mandatory training alone wouldn't fix the deep cracks in the culture, but it would start a conversation. New systems of accountability were put in place. Anonymous reporting channels were strengthened. And most importantly, Marcus began meeting with employees from every level, not as their boss, but as a man listening to their experiences. What he heard broke him and strengthened him at the same time. Stories of being overlooked for promotions. Stories of clients making racist remarks while managers stayed silent. Stories of quiet humiliation carried in silence because speaking up meant risking their livelihood. Each story was a mirror of his own journey, reminding him that racism wasn't something you outgrew when you became successful. It was a weight carried in every room, in every glance, in every assumption. And while his own success had shielded him in some ways, it had never erased the burden. But now Marcus saw his responsibility more clearly than ever. His success wasn't just his own, it was a weapon, a tool to carve out a safer space for those who still fought the battles he had once endured. If he failed to act, then his empire meant nothing. The impact rippled beyond the walls of his company. Word spread in the industry. Some praised him for his boldness, calling it a powerful stand against discrimination. Others whispered criticism, accusing him of overreacting, of risking the company's reputation by making the firings public. But Marcus didn't care. For him, protecting an image meant nothing if the foundation beneath it was rotten. He had lived too long seeing racism dressed in politeness, hidden behind corporate smiles, buried in layers of plausible deniability. This time, he refused to play along. One evening, alone in his office, Marcus stared out at the city skyline. The lights of the buildings glittered like stars, each one a reminder of the empire he had built. Yet his reflection in the glass looked different now, older perhaps, but stronger. He had walked into his own company stripped of everything and emerged with a truth that could no longer be ignored. And in that truth lay a question bigger than his company, bigger than himself. How many others were fighting the same silent battles, in places where no one dared to look? How many stories of prejudice were being swept under the rug because leaders chose comfort over confrontation? Marcus knew his actions wouldn't solve racism. One CEO could not erase centuries of injustice. But he also knew this: silence is complicity. Pretending not to see is a choice. And he refused to be the kind of leader who chose blindness for the sake of convenience. The impact on his employees lingered. Some left, uncomfortable with the change. Others stayed, relieved to finally feel seen. And slowly, the culture began to shift. Conversations that once happened in whispers now took place in the open. Respect, once forced, began to take root as something genuine. But the most profound change was in Marcus himself. He no longer saw his success as armor protecting him from racism. He saw it as a platform, one that demanded courage, demanded risk, demanded action. Because the truth was undeniable. Racism doesn't disappear when you reach the top. It doesn't vanish when you earn wealth or titles. It hides, it waits, and it dares you to confront it. Marcus had confronted it. And though the battle left scars, it also left a legacy. His story is not just about a CEO. It's about every worker who has been dismissed, every dreamer told they were unworthy, every voice silenced by prejudice. It's about the invisible. Battles fought in offices, in classrooms, in boardrooms across the world. Battles that remain unseen until someone is brave enough to pull back the curtain. And so, the question lingers for all of us. If prejudice can live unseen in a company built by a man who has faced it his entire life, where else does it live? In our schools? Our neighborhoods? Our own workplaces? Our own hearts? The story of Marcus Johnson is a reminder that the fight against racism is not about one dramatic moment, not about one leader or one company. It is about constant vigilance, about choosing truth over comfort, about refusing to let silence become permission. Marcus cleaned floors for one night and uncovered the dirt that years of success had failed to sweep away. What would we uncover if we looked closely at the places we live and work every day? And more importantly, will we choose to confront what we find, or will we turn away, pretending not to see?